For over 55 years, Allegro Pediatrics has partnered with families to heal, nurture, and empower children in their journey to adulthood. We offer care at 7 Eastside locations, availability 365 days a year, and convenient online scheduling. Allegro Pediatrics, where healthier futures begin.
For every kid that didn't have a chance, and every kid that was out of options, Seattle Children's is fighting for you. Because this isn't about beating the odds. It's about changing them for all kidkind.
Hello, my name is Laura Kastner, and I'm happy to join ParentEd Talks as your series moderator. I'm a clinical professor in both the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and the Department of Psychology at the University of Washington. I'm the author of 5 books on parenting and child development for parents. And I also have a clinical practice in which I see children, couples, and families. On behalf of ParentMap, we are thrilled to have put together a pool of some of the best parenting media in the country. Chicago Parent, Metro Parent, New York Family, and Staten Island Parent. And we're bringing you the 2023-2024 ParentEd Talks series. Thank you for joining us today for the ParentEd Talks event, Powerful Truths, Understanding Our Bias to Build a Better Future, with Khalil Gibran Muhammad, Ph.D. On behalf of our magnificent parenting media partners across the country, it's our collective passion and business to help build inclusive, safe, educated, and loving communities for our families. We are laser focused on how to build and serve families, and we never settle for the status quo. Before we kick off learning with Khalil, please take a moment to let us know what city you are joining from, and please put your answers in the Zoom chat. While we let everybody respond, we have a few housekeeping items to share with you. Today's webinar is being recorded and may be republished for educational and promotional usage. We will email everyone who registered a link to the recording after the event. We would love to hear your thoughts. The Zoom chat feature is open for you to share your comments and questions throughout the event. After the presentation, we will host a Q&A session. We encourage you to ask questions, and we will do our best to incorporate those questions into today's session. Closed captioning may be enabled by clicking the Zoom closed caption or the CC at the bottom of your screen. Okay, now I'm going to look at the chat and see where we're joining from. Okay, we have Seattle, we have Olympia in Washington. What else? Everybody's welcoming each other. Brooklyn, yay, where my father was born. What else? Okay, Minnesota, Midwest. New York City, with an exclamation point. Burlington, Washington. Amarillo, Texas, where I went to junior high. More Seattle. This is fun. We often get them from all over the world, but maybe they just are a little slower to show off their place of origin. Philly, okay. Puyallup, Washington. Okay, thank you and welcome to everyone. Okay, now I'm going to introduce Khalil. Khalil Gibran Muhammad, Ph.D., is the Ford Foundation Professor of History, Race, and Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School, and the director of the Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Project. He is the former director of the Schoenberg Center for Research and Black Culture Division of the New York Public Library, the world's largest archive of global Black history. They have 11 million items, and I want to say that a lot of people have asked about how they can get resources or direction for the work on race education, and I would say go to the Schoenberg, and you can even get a tour online, digitally, with Dr. Muhammad. I took it myself, but I also am coming to New York, and I have my ticket for October 20th in person. So I'm looking forward to that. You can also listen to his podcast. I'm going to talk more about that, but I get to do my own little promo. I would also recommend that people go to one of your books, Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern Urban America. It was published in 2017, which makes you prescient because, of course, that was before Black Lives Matter. And what Dr. Muhammad does in this seminal work is trace current police practices all the way back to after the Civil War, specifically 1890, 25 years after emancipation, and shows how I guess pseudoscience and Black stats were manipulated and have been manipulated to document Black criminality to distort the views of the public at that time. So it's a fascinating book. The citations are amazing. Black scholars, white newspapers. I would recommend the book. Okay, on to the podcast. I love this podcast. I can't stop listening to it. Another great resource that I would recommend. It's like parent media. Khalil does not shy away from heavy, pithy subjects, but in this podcast, he laces them with love and laughter with his friend. Well, Some of My Best Friends Are is the name of it, one of the wittiest names ever, because he co-hosts it with his best friend, Ben Austin, who is white, hence the title and the trope. And they deal with everything from Black Lives Matter, affirmative action, overturning of Roe, anti-Semitism, hate crimes, all while enjoying their friendship of many decades duration. And they end every episode with "I love you, man" to each other. Beautiful. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Khalil. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks for that very generous introduction. And I just want to say some of the topics on Some of My Best Friends are genuinely lighthearted, although awful playful on what we call the absurdities of race. So that's a really generous introduction. And today's topic, I think, could not be more urgent in light of everything that's happening in this country and to some degree around the world when we consider the attacks on truth as they affect the existential threats of climate change or other versions of propaganda that lead to fascism in different parts of the world. So as much as I know some of us have more immediate concerns about how to give our children the best education possible and to rear global citizens, some of this responsibility that falls on us as parents has huge stakes for the society that we actually live in.
3% LY.
Not sure what's happening. All right. So I want to just lay out kind of the map of what I'm going to talk about over the next 25, 30 minutes. I work at an organization called the Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Project, and we are initiating work around what we call the Bias Ed Project. So today I'll be presenting some of the context in which we think that work is relevant, and it falls upon many of you to help to bring this work to fruition. So let's talk about powerful truths, understanding our bias to build a better future. Next slide, please. And so here's just a little taste of what IRA works on and my colleagues. So IRA stands for the Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Project. We promote anti-racism as a core value and institutional norm through rigorous research and real-time policy analysis. Our work looks across various industries such as healthcare, education, private sector or corporate sector, as well as a broad examination of various truth-telling practices or racial healing practices in a number of countries around the globe. We also host an annual conference. This year, it'll be broken out in 2 days on September 28th and October 4th. And you can go to our website. You can really just put IRA Project Harvard in your Google search engine or Bing search engine, and you'll land on our homepage, and you can find out more information about the annual Truth and Transformation Conference, which is coming up very soon. Next slide, please. So let's talk about why is bias ed necessary? I think in broad strokes, most people in 2023 have a keen awareness of the stakes of what we are generally talking about when we talk about the problem of human bias. This is not a new concept. For at least the past decade or more, people have been exposed to bias test results or audit tests or self-evaluations My colleague at Harvard invented the IAT test, the implicit association test, which many people have taken to find out across multiple identity axes, whether it's religion, whether it's body type, whether it's sexuality, whether it's gender, and of course, race, the degree to which people have various biases. And kind of the takeaway from much of that research, which has been going on for a long time, and the social psychologists have been leading that work, is that everyone has bias because we live in a world of profound inequality. And our brains are essentially built to make fast decisions. Not yet, we can stay on why is bias necessary. Our brains are built to make efficient decisions, mostly as an evolutionary response to save our lives. You see something stirring in the forest and it looks like an animal, your brain tells you potential danger, you might want to find safe place, a high spot in a tree, or you might want to run. But learned bias in terms of how we relate to one another is a consequence of what happens at very young ages. Children at very young ages are able to discern human difference. They have no idea what to make of it. They have no idea how to create hierarchies of difference. In other words, they're not prepared to ascribe to one group or another superiority or inferiority, but they are able to see it. And we've known this for a very long time. So because they see it, they then begin to learn based on their cultural environment. What happens in their homes, what happens on the streets, in the playgrounds, in the schools. Children very quickly begin to pick up the biases of the world we live in. And because we know for a fact, without dispute, that there's profound stratification in American society and in nearly every country in the world, those biases map onto physical differences. And if we do nothing else, children will quickly begin to determine that some groups do better than others. The reasons for that are not always clear to them, but clearly they understand that they see certain kinds of people in positions of leadership and power, and they see other kinds of people in positions of service. Next slide, please. So one of the ways that the earliest forms of bias take place in who are our children's teachers. So of course, we live in a large country with millions of students. Nearly 50 million students attend public schools and another 5 million attend private schools in the United States. And as has been announced and predicted over the past several years now, the United States is becoming browner than when it was a long time ago. Even in the very beginning, for example, as the indigenous population died from war, conquest, and disease, the Black population, for example, peaked at 20% in 1790. That number has remained fairly stable. And so America for a long time was European descended large population, upwards of 80% of that population, or 75% of the population, as other groups began to come along in the 20th century. So today in our classrooms, while nearly 50% are Black, Indigenous, or students of color in public schools, next slide, please, our teachers are way overrepresented. There are about 3.5 million full and part-time public school teachers, only of which, as we colloquially describe, are BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, or people of color, about 19%, and 81% are white. So one of the earliest forms of bias, if no one even opens their mouths, is that the vast majority of children, white and Black, will enter into K through 12 education, and they will see the first person outside of their circle of family, generally a white woman, as a school teacher, conveying the rules of society, teaching them to love themselves, teaching them how to be productive members of our community. Those precious messages to our very young children reinforce in their minds that the people who have a lot to share, who have good information, and who can be trusted on average are white. That is not to say that they will never have an experience with a person of color in a trusting authority role, but it is a rare experience for white and Black children in the United States of America, something that we need to change, but also something that we can address. Next slide. And so if we took as a given that bias, whether implicit or explicit, is normal in our society. It's been that way for a long time. A society built on slavery, built on legal segregation. I was born in 1972. My parents were born into a time of literal legal segregation. I was arguably considered, my generation, I'm 51, one of the first generation to be born outside of formal segregation in the United States, to say nothing of the dismantling of the legacy effects of formal segregation, or to say nothing of the fact that new forms of racial oppression, such as mass incarceration, emerged in 1970, 5 years after the end of the civil rights movement. So that's another lecture. We can talk about that in Q&A if people want to understand more. What I am saying to you is that we already have had a longstanding problem that arguably might have been addressed within the past decade through such things like implicit bias research or emergent efforts, both in classrooms for culturally responsive teaching, or in light of the larger racial justice movement, Black Lives Matter, that largely aimed its sights on anti-Black police violence. But turns out that in the past couple of years, since really the fall of 2020, there has been a concerted effort around the country to stem the tide for making progress in how we socialize young children and older children to understand both our history and how bias in society works. On the left, represented by the pink dots, you see the number of states, roughly 36 states in this country, that have done various things to restrict education on racism, bias, or the contributions of specific groups, racialized groups in the United States. Some, such as those at the Critical Law Studies Center at UCLA, argue or have found that out of 50 states, 49 at various levels of government have attempted some form of blocking the teaching of racism or sexuality or gender discrimination. On the right, represented by the blue dots, you see some states have made efforts to pass protective legislation in order to make it harder for people to block the effort to teach about racism. And if you're smart, you've added 36 plus 17, you say that's 53, that's too many states. Some states are double counted because they've done both. Next slide, please. And so this is a profound problem that is actually a new development in light of the scale of the problem that we already inherited from hundreds of years of inequality in the United States. And as such, to add to the backlash that is happening legislatively in this country, we also know from research from the Education Trust that there is a profound lack of teacher unpreparedness, meaning teachers are not prepared to be able to take on the challenge of teaching a more educated student, a more diverse student population. So when we think about whether states have prepared their teaching population, which we've already noted is overwhelmingly, in this case, white women, we find that according to Ed Trust research, the vast majority of states represented here by red versus those that are in yellow versus those that are in green do not meet certain standards that we would expect teachers to be able to bring to the classroom. Next slide, please. And so these racial inequalities are manifest not only in the backlash against what can be taught, the lack of preparedness of teachers, but also the traditional problems of leveling that have been an ongoing challenge since the end of formal segregation in public education beginning in the mid-1950s. Here, again, according to Ed Trust, we recognize that a number of Black students who would otherwise be qualified for gifted and talented programs are disproportionately denied access to those programs in 35 of 37 states that they've looked at. Again, the red bar graphs represent states that have significant restrictions. Yellow to green represents lessening of those restrictions, with a shout out here to the state of Alaska and New York, where Black students are more fairly represented in gifted and talented programs. One way to think about this is as a kind of 360-degree holistic approach to understanding who's doing the teaching, how prepared are they, what are state legislatures saying ought to be taught in the classroom in the first place, and then the degree to which traditional practices of making widely accessible who gets access to the best education within elementary schools. Turns out all of those things are significant problems in our society. Next slide, please. Only 1% of Latinx and 4% of Black children are enrolled in high-quality state preschool programs. In 26 states where early childhood education enrollment is reported by race and ethnicity, not a single one truly provided high-quality access for Black and Latino 3 and 4-year-olds. Again, research published by Ed Trust in 2019. And so when we take a massive step back, we see that disproportionately children of color are less likely to see a representation of themselves in terms of who's teaching. We live in residentially segregated environments, so they are less likely to see representations of people who are like them in positions of leadership and authority, whether it's in the classroom, although in some cases, Black children may grow up in cities that have Black mayors, but there are far fewer cities that have Black mayors than one would think, and certainly was true even a generation ago. And so the scale of representation alone suggests to us that if we don't have an intervention for our children, we will continue to see more of the same. On one hand, white children will be socialized to think that the world revolves around them, at least to a greater extent than Black and brown children. I'll share with you the work of Margaret Hagerman. She's a sociologist and author of White Kids Growing Up with Privilege in a Racially Divided America. She writes, quote, "So while children may learn the social norms that it's inappropriate to talk about race, it's unlikely that they have stopped thinking about it. In US society, children have been conditioned to see whiteness as the norm and a universal signifier of beauty, of authority, of the right to belong. In children's book, they are socialized to see white people with agency as heroes of the story and whose lives matter. But for Black, Indigenous, and other children of color, they are too often missing from these stories or are marginal characters or are at worst the villains." Some of you may remember, for example, a couple of summers ago when Justice Ketanji Brown was being nominated, or at least was going through the nomination process at a senatorial hearing to join the US Supreme Court. The book by Ibram Kendi, Anti-Racist Baby, became an exhibit in a discussion about the anti-white bias of Ketanji Brown, who was on the board of a school, a private school in DC, who had adopted the book for the purposes of helping to create a more inclusive curriculum. This is the world turned upside down. Literally, the effort to address the lack of representation in children's book now has become an excuse for arguing that those efforts are racist and anti-white. And so we persist. Hagerman reminds us that the stakes for what we do with our white children are as important as the work that we do amongst and for Black and brown children in our society. Next slide, please. And so there's good news and bad news, in a sense, mixed news. In a 2022 CBS News poll, US adults were asked, "Is racism a problem today?" Less than half of them essentially argued that it was not a problem, which means a slight majority of them said it was. Of those who said it was not, 28% said it was minor and 14% said it's not a problem at all. In the aggregate, white people were slightly overrepresented in those numbers. When asked how much Black history do schools teach, 11% said too much, 42% said too little, and 24% said right amount. So if we take that as evidence of the possibility that there are actually more people in America that want Black history in the classroom, that's actually some good news. Essentially, about 68% think we actually do it right, which we don't, but 42% said we need more. And then finally, teaching students about race makes them, quote, understand what others went through in the past, 68%, more racially tolerant, 42%. And for that, whites were, again, about average with the total numbers. So I point to these statistics because the legislative attacks in more than 24 states to restrict the teaching of race and racism or sex and gender in various classrooms actually doesn't square with the degree to which when Americans are asked more generally about why this is important, those two things don't exactly come together. We might call this cognitive dissonance. And so that's actually some good news. Next slide, please. But nevertheless, when we look closely at states that have led this effort against the attempt to broaden and make more inclusive our history standards, to essentially enfold the understanding of the histories of forms of racism and racial bias into our learning from K through 12, a place like Florida has been at the front lines, like Texas, Iowa, North Dakota, Tennessee, Arkansas, many other states have been at the front of trying to block those efforts. Recently, you might have heard that the state of Florida updated its social studies curriculum. And here, one of those standards notes here that the benchmark clarifications that should be taught, and I'll simply read, instruction includes how slaves developed skills, which in some instances could be applied for their personal benefit. Now, I'll say something that isn't often said in news stories around this, which is that that's literally true. Enslaved people who were very skilled as masons or carpenters, furniture makers, they had agricultural skills, did actually bring those skills to various markets, sometimes even in the context of enslavement, meaning they worked beyond the conditions of their enslavement with permission from their slaveholder to take on additional work. In places like Maryland, enslaved people would leave a plantation to work in Baltimore to make a little extra money. This did happen. The problem isn't that this didn't happen. The problem is that the context in which this is taught, this becomes a major focus of essentially diminishing the impact of slavery, both in its brutality, in its dehumanization, and the long-term impacts on Black people who literally went from slavery to a system of segregation and Jim Crow, even if they had skills that ostensibly could have been parlayed for economic mobility, which in fact, according to the vast majority of Black people's experiences, even after slavery, that did not happen. So this is a distortion of an actual literal fact into a larger narrative that diminishes the impact of slavery. I want to dwell on this for just a moment, because even if I don't have a slide, I want to show you precisely why this is such a big deal. In the same Florida history standards, near the end of the curriculum, which any one of you can Google for yourself, and you can read all the standards, I am hiding nothing here. I want to point out to you at the end of the social studies curriculum standards, there's an entire unit that teaches students about the Holocaust. And this is important because the level of sophistication with which Florida wants students to understand the Holocaust is a total opposite. It stands in full juxtaposition, in stark contrast to how students are being taught about the history, or I should say, in this case, the history of slavery and segregation in that state. I'll just read very quickly one of the standards for Florida. They want students to learn the effects of Holocaust denial on contemporary society. Students will explain how Holocaust denial has helped contribute to the creation of contemporary propaganda and the facile denial of political and social realities. They want them to understand why it is important for current and future generations to learn from the Holocaust. They want students to explain the significance of learning from Holocaust-era primary sources. They want students to explain the significance of listening to the testimony of Holocaust survivors. They want students to explain the significance of never again, to recognize that anti-Semitism includes a certain perception of the Jewish people, which may be expressed as hatred towards Jewish people, rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism directed toward a person or his or her property or toward Jewish community institutions or religious facilities. Make no mistake about it, and hear me very clearly. That's what we want. The problem is that's not what Florida wants when it comes to understanding anti-Black racism. And therein lies the manipulation of a certain set of facts to yield a certain interpretation of the past, as opposed to a certain set of facts to yield a more accurate interpretation of the past. Next slide, please. So here we are in a country where we know from other evidence, particularly from the Southern Poverty Law Center in a 2018 report, that as much as Florida and many other states teach something about Civil War and Reconstruction in Florida, it turns out that we know as of 2018 from a national sample of social studies teachers that only 8% of students could identify slavery as the central cause of the Civil War. That's the scale of the problem that we face at this time before the backlash, and will only be more problematic because of the backlash and the massive banning of books that have happened around the country. Next slide, please. Some of you also may have heard about the College Board's African American Studies curriculum, which was a major breakthrough in a long-standing effort to bring African American studies to a wider audience of high school students for the purposes of gaining potentially college credit as they went on to high school. Everyone understands how important AP classes have been, despite the inequalities that go along with AP classes, which maps back onto who gets to take them. So there are problems, make no mistake about it. But even within the context of those problems of inequality about who gets to take AP and who doesn't, the number of courses that would have centered a broader understanding of the history of race and racism in America was zero until this class was invented. Nevertheless, in light of news of it being piloted, the state of Florida and now several other states, including Texas and Arkansas and Kentucky, have essentially said that there's too much politics in the African American Studies curriculum, and essentially compelled through their political influence and the College Board's acquiescence to that political pressure to remove certain key concepts, such as how race, gender, and class impact Black people. In other words, these three identities form a unique experience, particularly for poor Black women or for trans people who are in the Black community who may not experience their own impression in the same way that a cisgendered heteronormative man like myself. They struck from it teaching about Black freedom movements. They removed much of the history of the Black Panther Party or things that have happened since the 1960s, which would fall under the category of more contemporary understandings of the efforts against racism and inequality, and ultimately deny the fact that the issues of the past continue to resonate in the present today. The good news is that the College Board has decided to go back to the drawing board whether or not Florida will eventually adopt that curriculum or not. We are all waiting to see what the final result will look like. Next slide, please. And so these ongoing attacks on Black studies are not isolated to the history and present of Black people's freedom struggles. They extend to those whose own non-gender conforming identities have been subject to attack and legislation that just restricts gender-affirming healthcare, bans the ability for trans children to seek healthcare, or in cases like Florida, ban the ability to even talk about sexualities that are not cis, that are not focused on heteronormative family life. These are existential threats to the health and the mental health of our young people in this country, because the bottom line is most of these efforts have been moving in the right direction in order to make possible that all children would be see themselves and be included in our nation's classrooms. Next slide, please. And so what we are calling for in the Bias Ed Project is to inspire parents, teachers, and school leaders to adopt universal bias education as a social vaccine, to inoculate children against racism, sexism, xenophobia, and other forms of bias in every school in the United States. Research shows how very young children begin to see and act on physical differences in harmful ways with long-term consequences for their safety and well-being, general public health, as well as the overall functioning and fairness of our economy and democracy. I know many of you on this call, but maybe not all of you, took note of the young people who were present during the January 6th insurrection. And a couple of those young people were famously captured holding a Confederate flag as they walked through the corridors, holding standing behind a man holding a Confederate flag as they walk through the corridors of the Capitol Rotunda. Whatever we think of what happened on January 6th as a direct threat on the democratic process and the peaceful transfer of power between an elected president and a former president, our young people were witnesses to that. And if we don't talk about it, if we don't talk about the meaning of the Confederate flag and why for the first time in US history it flew in the Capitol, not during the 19th century, not during the Civil War, not during the period of segregation, but in 2021, then we are failing our children, and ultimately we are failing our democracy. And so what we need to do is to promote awareness, effective interventions, and model curricula for schools. Next slide, please. And so what if we had a mandatory and standardized curriculum for all pre-K through 12 students in the US on racial bias and other biases? We think that just like sex ed is an important effort to prevent children from doing harm to themselves or to others because they don't understand how their bodies work or they haven't been taught to respect the bodies of others, we believe that an early effort to begin to make children aware of how bias works will create healthier adults. Children will be inoculated against developing bias like a set of childhood vaccinations to prevent development of socialized racial biases and build immunity through race-conscious education, including racial identity awareness, culturally responsive education, and critical US history. And so with that, final slide, I want to thank you for your time and attention. You can find out more information about our work overall at IRA, or I should say website is ira.hks.harvard.edu. And of course, ParentMap is a wonderful partner in this work, and we're grateful to be able to participate in their program series. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Khalil, for that presentation. And that really helped us address one of our key agendas here, and that is activism and advocacy in the schools for the curriculum and also dealing with the schools. And we also have a lot of questions from the parents about what to do in the home. So let's start that one. Like sex ed, an area that I have been very active in, given that that was my doctoral thesis, is adolescent sexuality. And in that role, we've for decades have used that concept of immunization because you're really protecting children and helping them be safe and well-adjusted and prepared for the complexities of their future and their relationships. And you've used that same metaphor, which I appreciate because this is about helping kids be stronger and healthier and more caring. But like sex ed, a lot of parents want to talk about race and race education, but they feel awkward and ill-prepared. And so often they just end up not talking about racism. So how would you advise parents who want to deal with their own discomfort and inadequacy about trying to talk to their kids more about race education?
Well, they could start with Some of My Best Friends Are. That is both shameless self-promotion, but it makes a simple point. We are overwhelmed. I shouldn't say that. That's not the right way to put it. We are blessed with a tremendous amount of easily accessible free resources, just a few literal keyboard clicks away. So one of the resources, aside from my own work, but one of the resources that I teach in a graduate level class at the Harvard Kennedy School where I work is a podcast called Scene on Radio, SCENE, meaning scene as in a movie scene. It's a wonderful podcast produced out of Duke University with John Buin and Chinjirai Komonichi, who is a professor of communications. And essentially it is easily digestible and incredibly rich content for understanding American history, the history of whiteness, what people have now maligned as critical race theory. That's just one example, in addition to my podcast, in addition to a number of young readers that have been produced or written by colleagues of mine, the most famous of whom is Ibram Kendi's Stamped, which has been converted into multiple versions at all levels of reading. I just want to say that people have to take some responsibility for making an effort to use resources that are widely abundant at this time. My website makes recommendations. We have a summer reading list. So some of what I just described are available online. But if you literally just Google anti-racist resources for age-appropriate parenting, you will find lots of things. Now, of course, you have to be careful. There are some rabbit holes and there are some disingenuous websites out there, but I think most adults understand how to find quality material. So that's where it begins. I'd also say that as someone who's met with people at Scholastic, at Newsela, at other major publishers of age appropriate content for young learners, a lot of these organizations have worked really hard to improve the numbers of resources from young adult books, from picture books, and so forth, for parents to be able to give to their children, for their children to learn how to read on. In other words, even the act of learning how to read with content that helps to understand some of these biases, some of these histories, or just simply storytelling that includes a richer cast of diverse characters. There's just so much more than there was even a decade ago. So that's my answer to that question. Make an effort to teach yourself so that you can teach children.
Right. And something we've often said in the sex ed world is you might be a little clunky, you might stumble over your words, but it's better than nothing, as I have a quote from one of your buddies, Jeff Robinson: "The truth is painful, but it's much less dangerous than a lie or an omission," I would say. It's not helping your kid be stronger by avoiding what you call hard histories.
Yeah, can I just add one more point to this that's personal, because I don't want this to seem like I'm imposing on other people what I haven't done for myself. I have 3 kids. They're much older now. They're 23, 21, and 17. But when they were very young, because of what I do for a living, they really were exposed to much of the ugly parts of American history at a young age. Our decision as parents of our small children at the time was not to shy away from it. And I'll tell you why. Because for our Black children who grew up in largely overwhelmingly white environments, partly because I lived in a college town, Indiana University, when my children were very young, they were more or less the only Black children, sometimes sharing space with South Asian children or East Asian children, or very few Latino children in Bloomington, Indiana, where they lived at the time. People were ascribing to them difference without them having to do anything but come to school. One of my daughters was told, she couldn't play with a group of kids because she was too brown. Another one of my kids came home and told me that his Jewish friend had been disinvited from a birthday party that everyone's invited to because Jews killed Christ. And this was 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So the point being that some people have the luxury, if you're part of the white majority, to pretend like these things aren't happening because they're not happening to you. But inevitably, children will pass on the cultural toxicity that they live in. And that form of bullying will eventually find its way to a child who has red hair, or who has a disability or a funny accent, or is too poor, or, you name it. So we all know this. And so the effort to deal with it has to be a collective responsibility if we want young children to be healthier and ultimately want a safer, more prosperous, multiracial democracy.
Right. Well, another point to all this is that we want to stand up and be an upstander and a promoter of race education with our kids, but we also want our kids to stand up and, speaking of bullying, and stand up for other individuals when they see racism. This is what John Lewis would call good trouble, right? So yeah. How do we support our kids in being upstanders?
Yes. Absolutely. So we support our kids by modeling that behavior. Most of us will have opportunities as adults with our children present to stand up, even if it's vicarious, meaning we're watching the news together, you happen to be driving and you hear something happens, you can pause and say, that person did the right thing, or someone should have defended that person. That kind of social awareness about the world we live in is not piercing the innocence of your child. It's preparing your child to be an adult in a world one day that is, a very tough life. Most people don't have the luxury of avoiding the difficulties that life will throw their way. And so we often think about protecting innocence, but again, the burden of innocence is not equally distributed in our society. And so children who are poor, if they happen to be white, and children who are Black, whether they are poor or middle class, will face greater exposure and be more vulnerable to certain structural inequalities in our society. And if you want to teach your child how to be an upstander, then you have to talk about those things. You have to expose your children to how those burdens came to be and those inequalities exist in an effort to help them be part of change.
On that same note, something that I have noticed is that sometimes when parents and teachers encounter kids engaging in racist talk or racism, they directly shame their kids. And for especially middle school and high school, sometimes that can backfire. And on the other hand, they need to confront those acts. So how would you advise adults navigate those challenging situations? And maybe you could give some examples, especially for parents of middle schoolers.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is a bit of a Pandora's box. So let me say that once children enter into an awareness of this, then, you're navigating the awkwardness of children who can be very blunt in how they assess things that are happening. And once they have language for that assessment, it feels very treacherous. And certainly if that discovery is happening in a classroom, for example, and not in the home, then there's all sorts of potential for offense and triggers to happen, you name it. So trust me, I understand that. And this is one of the reasons why the Bias Ed Project is so important, because if we were to commit tomorrow to doing this, it would be a little bit like the COVID vaccine problem. There'd be a lot of hesitation. There'd be a lot of people who weren't sure. There'd be a lot of vaccine denialism. There'd be debates about it. Look what happened. I took the vaccine and something bad happened to me rather than something good happened to me. The vaccine doesn't work, you name it. But guess what? Here we are 3 years into the vaccine. There's a massive uptick of a new variant circulating. And according to scientists, we are at near 100% basic immunity, meaning that globally, most people have been exposed either to a vaccine in the past, which gives them a dose of what can kill us, or they've had it themselves, which means that even though people are testing positive for COVID right now, a lot of people are much healthier in response to it. There are some hospitalizations. Here's the point. When you start this process, it's not easy and it's tough. And the rules of the road aren't clear. But what is clear is that in the absence of doing this work, we live in a profoundly unjust society. And the harms, again, are not equally shared. And so what we need is better teacher preparation. We need parents to work together amongst their friends groups to do this so that their children who are on play dates in other people's homes will reinforce these ideas. I have a nephew who lives in Florida who was called a monkey by his 8-year-old peer about 2 months ago. And when his mom and dad went to the neighbor's house to say that their child had called my Black nephew a monkey, their parents denied it. My kid would never say that. We can't get anywhere if people aren't willing to accept responsibility for the fact that every white person I know has been in a conversation where white people have discussed other groups in racist ways. That's just a fact. So, and maybe it's not 100%, maybe it's 85%. It's enough, it's too much. And so you have to commit to this work. And if we work together as parents and as teachers and as responsible adults, then that's where we began to see long-term change. In Germany, for example, since the 1970s, they have made a concerted effort to ensure that every child understands what happened in the Holocaust. You can't understand Germany's constitution without understanding that it was rewritten after World War II in many ways by Americans who were leading an effort at denazification. So it's impossible for a child growing up in Germany today to not understand why their country is built the way it is without understanding what happened in the 1930s and 1940s. Only in America can we pretend as if all these things in the past didn't happen, or somehow what happened in the 1960s is ancient history and nobody should talk about it because it's bad for America. So if you just pause and think about it, that's how absurd it is, what we're dealing with. And we can change that.
I'm going to directly go to the questions from our participants today, Khalil. But first, I'm supposed to take a pause and ask everybody to respond to a poll and let us know which publication you used when you registered for this event. So you can be doing that. Thank you for taking a moment to do that. But the questions that have already come in are really good. And I'd say, 6, 7, 8 of them all were the same one. And that is, here's one. How do I provide a more diverse mindset if I don't live in a very diverse area? And sort of similar, do you have thoughts on what we white but anti-bias motivated parents can intentionally do to come into contact with people who are more diverse racially and culturally? So a lot of white parents are saying, I want to provide this, but how do I do it?
Well, I'm sure that many of those parents have never met a wizard or a warlock or played Quidditch. But because of the miracle of Harry Potter, understand what it's like to embody an alternative universe. So again, I really do want to say this in the spirit of love and generosity. We have so many on-ramps for parents to develop empathy, white parents to develop empathy amongst their white children, even in all white spaces. You cannot literally turn on the radio or streaming channel or the television or go to the movies and not see a universe of non-white people who are standing in as some representation of good, of villainy, of sports athleticism, of entertainment, you name it. The thing is that if you don't talk about who those people are in the fullness, rather than them simply being a celebrity, if you don't talk about the context in which those people represent communities that have had a unique journey in this country, then you're missing the opportunities that you have. Why is it the case, for example, that in many pockets of white America, children at some point either vicariously or directly participate in forms of blackface or brownface? They play Mexican, they play a rapper or a gangster because they see the world beyond their own immediate community, even if there's only white people there. So I just want people to take responsibility for working a little bit harder to think about the world we actually live in that is saturated with diversity, even if most of your neighbors are whites, even if you go to an all-white school.
Yeah, and there are just so many natural opportunities, whether it's on the radio or in news, you can call out what you don't like and what you do like, the heroes that are the upstanders again, and laud them, because those represent our values, right? Who are you applauding from, toddlerhood on up when you look at the news or you're reading literature, and which ones are you saying that's not okay, and we're going to stand behind that. Okay, here's another question. As Black parents, what can we do to ensure that we do not pass on to our children our feelings of trauma, limiting thoughts, and low self-esteem brought on by our own experience with racism?
Well, I think we have to work on us first. And so the old airline stewardess or flight attendant advice, which is that in the event of the lack of cabin pressure, put your mask on first and then assist those around you. If we know, for example, as Black adults that we have experienced trauma in our lives, whether it is familial or societal, we have to do the work to make sure we're as healthy as possible so that we can help to rear our children in ways that are most productive for them. That's just basic. And that may mean talking to a therapist. It may mean joining a book club. It may mean listening more intentionally to material that is more about social justice or social consciousness or racial justice, whatever word works for you that makes you feel okay about taking this journey. I think that's the opportunity that even for Black parents that they have in order to be part of this change.
Here's one from a different source. How do I introduce this concepts of race and privilege to my toddler who is mixed with a family that is mostly Mexican, but also white presenting?
Well, again, I think multiracial children often find themselves betwixt and between identities because as much as we live in a world with tremendous diversity by virtue of nationality, of immigrant status, of language diversity, we often create a false construct of a white-black hierarchy. On one hand, that white-black hierarchy is not just a function of how we recreate it, it's a function of an actual history and a set of policies that reinforce that. There's a lot of pressure in the United States, particularly for newer immigrant populations, to identify with white people, with honorary whiteness. I can't tell you, I teach at a school with 50% of our student population are international students, and many of them report in their essays that they write in my classes that their immigrant parents of color tell them, look, as much as possible, keep your distance from Black people. It's not good for you. Keep company and outside of those communities, and you'll have a better chance of succeeding in America. So we have to be thoughtful about the degree to which our sense of who we are in relation to others matters. And so for those multiracial children, the stakes may be even higher for being sensitive to their pressure to identify one way or another, to essentially hide something about them that they may feel a connection to, but they may feel that is not welcomed. One last point on this, it is just known that within the broader Latin American diaspora, Blackness is often actively discouraged in terms of relationships, in terms of skin color, in terms of how often people of Latin American status see a color hierarchy where the more dark skin, the less attractive, and the more light skin, the more attractive. So if you are raising a child within an environment where this is operating socially, you will have to disrupt that. You'll have to intervene in order to have your child not accept that point of view.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of what you're saying is the importance of early on, no matter what your background is, building a sense of a positive and affirmative identity on who you are and the family. And you do that through rituals and food and how you celebrate, and to build that up. I know, having worked with some, what you're talking about with refugees coming from other countries, they're taught to almost put that aside so that they can assimilate. That's still happening now with new immigrants. And so everywhere we go, no matter what your background, you can have a positive cultural identity. So I hope this parent heard your comments. I am supposed to wrap up now. So I want to thank you so much, Khalil. I mean, of course, we want more hours with you, but we'll just have to go back and cherish the words that you had and go on the web to all these resources that are there. You've made a really strong comment about it's there. It's a matter of committing to it, whether it's literature or documentaries or podcasts. The material is there for race education in our home and in our schools. So I want to thank everybody for joining us, and give a special thank you to Khalil and our media partners. If you haven't already, please register for the entire 2023-2024 ParentEd Talks series, and don't miss any of our upcoming talks. See the link in the chat to sign up right now. We hope you will join us for our next ParentEd Talk event, Atypical Approaches, Unlike the Brilliance and the Beauty of Your Differently Wired Kid, with best-selling author Debbie Reber. So with that, I'll bid you a goodbye. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Laura.
Yeah.
Everyone well. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.